Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We can now go live to Coventry, where he's just been introduced there by Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Becky, thank you very much for that introduction. And before I start, I just think we should pause for a moment and send our condolences to those that lost their lives in Leicester last night, and thank the emergency services, the police, the fire and ambulance and local residents for all the help and support that they gave to the victims of that tragedy last night. And could I also say a big thank you to Coventry University for allowing us this space this morning. Ultra high-tech all around us. The modern Labour Party, ultra high-tech. You're supposed to laugh at that point. Thank you very much. And also the work that Coventry University does in cutting-edge technology, research technology, and ensuring that the skills of decades in Coventry that built aircraft, that built cars, that built so much else are developed into the high-tech that we want for the 21st century of sustainable industries and sustainable technology. And can I also thank the shadow ministers that are here today. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's doing such an incredible job on business and trade. Barry Gardner, who's doing a great job on trade itself. Becky and you work together, OK? And Keir Starmer, who's done such a brilliant job in holding the government to account and forcing them to retreat time after time on the whole issue of Brexit negotiations. Thank you very much for being here. And welcome the Coventry MPs for being here today. Thank you very much indeed. The City of Coventry, and I think we should also thank Geoffrey Robinson for the incredible work he did on Friday in the Organ Donors Bill in Parliament. It's made an incredible difference to the lives of many, many people. It's long been at Britain's industrial heartland is where we are now, and now set to be our next City of Culture. So well done, Coventry, on that. And I look forward to joining in the City of Culture celebrations. And indeed, I was given a book of photography within the Asian community this morning by the university, which I will treasure. Thank you. Next month, the government will embark on the second and most crucial phase of negotiations to leave the European Union, to set the terms of Britain's relationship with the EU for the long term. We're now 20 months on from the referendum that voted to leave, and a year on from the triggering of Article 50. But the country is still in the dark about what this divided Conservative government actually wants out of Brexit. They can't agree amongst themselves about what their priorities are or what the future they want for Britain after Brexit. They've got no shortage of sound bites and slogans, of course. The Foreign Secretary says it will be a liberal Brexit. The Prime Minister says it will be a red, white and blue Brexit. On other days, it's a bespoke economic partnership. The Brexit Secretary at least now promises it won't be a Mad Max-style dystopia, which you might think was setting the bar a little low. While the Trade Secretary can't contain himself at the prospect of pushing Britain into a spiral of deregulation in rights and standards. And the Cabinet seems to have agreed at Chequers to leave the door open to that while their ambitious managed diversion goes on, whatever that means. But the truth is, we really don't know much more about where they're actually heading in these talks. While workers, businesses and everyone who voted in the referendum just want to know what the government's approach to Brexit is likely to mean for their future and the future of the country. As the opposition, we have been trying to hold this government to account. We have a duty to do that. Our message has been consistent since the vote to leave 20 months ago. We respect the result of the referendum. Our priority is to get the best deal for people's jobs, living standards and the economy, as Becky was explaining in her opening remarks. We reject any race to the bottom in workers' rights, environmental safeguards, consumer protections or food safety standards. And we've pushed the government to act. to guarantee the rights of European Union citizens living here and of UK citizens who've made their homes elsewhere in Europe. And I want to thank all those European Union nationals that have made their homes here, made such an incredible contribution to our communities, our lives and our public services, and say to the government, it's a shame on them. They've been through 20 months of uncertain horror because there's been no guarantee of their future. We will protect their rights by legislating immediately to guarantee permanent residence for EU nationals living here and the right to bring their families here. We also want to ensure there's a transition period on the existing terms. That was the very strong point that Keir and other colleagues put in Parliament, which would minimise disruption and avoid an economic cliff edge, to avoid any return to a hard border in Northern Ireland, and to guarantee Parliament a meaningful vote on the final deal. The Conservative government has dithered and delayed. Their divisions, their incompetence and their deregulation obsession risk putting jobs and living standards at risk as we leave the European Union. This is an economy that has already been damaged by 8 years of Conservative austerity, where wages are still lower today than they were a decade ago, where productivity lags dangerously behind other major economies, where the government has failed to invest and modernise, where more people are living in poverty, and where closing the deficit that was due to be eradicated in 2015, then 2016, then 2017, then 2020, and now been put back to 2025. After years of Tory bluster and slogans, the Conservatives have been found out. They have no economic plan and they have no Brexit plan. Every so often, they wheel out Boris Johnson to promise once more they'll cough up more money for the NHS after Brexit. And they've spent the last 8 years not giving money to the National Health Service that so desperately needs it. Even while they've been able to find billions of pounds, billions, to cut taxes for the richest corporations, to cut capital gains tax for the super rich elite, and to scrap the 50% rate for the richest too. And found billions more to cut inheritance tax on the wealthiest estates and to slash the bank levy. Yet the National Health Service has been subjected to the longest financial squeeze in its history. This is a government that failed our NHS pre-Brexit and during Brexit, and certainly can't be trusted with the NHS post-Brexit. Labour will give the NHS the resources it needs, because we will raise tax on the top 5% and big businesses, those with the broadest shoulders to pay, not by making up numbers and parading them on the side of a bus. We will fund, and we will use the funds returned from Brussels after Brexit to invest in our public services and the jobs of the future, not tax cuts for the richest. Today, I want to set out Labour's approach to Brexit in more detail, how we would do things differently, what our priorities are for the Brexit negotiation, and the values that underpin them. The first is our overriding mission, that whatever is negotiated must put people's jobs and living standards first. The Brexit process must not leave our people and country worse off. We're committed to building a more prosperous and more equal Britain, in which every region benefits and no community, absolutely no community, is left behind. As we set out in our manifesto, and that is what underpins our approach to Brexit. The second is unity. Most people in our country, regardless of whether they voted Leave or Remain, want better jobs, more investment, stronger rights and greater equality. So we will not let those who want to sow divisions drive this process. No scapegoating of migrants no setting one generation against another, and no playing off the nations of the UK. No one should be willing to sacrifice the Good Friday Agreement, the basis of 20 years of relative peace and development and respect for diversity in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was a huge achievement, and on this anniversary of it, let's respect that and the achievement that went behind it and not allow that to be undermined during the Brexit process. The third is our global perspective. We are leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe. We're not throwing up protectionist barriers, closing the borders and barricading ourselves in. And we want a close and cooperative relationship with the whole of Europe after Brexit. We are a party of internationalists. We know that our interests are bound up with millions of others all across the globe. Whether that's in order to tackle the huge challenges of climate change, build a more peaceful world, or clamp down on the tax-dodging elite who think by bestriding the globe they can avoid paying their share for vital public services. I want to address each of these principles today because together they define Labour's approach to Brexit, the Labour Party's values, and what the next Labour government will seek to deliver in office. So many of the areas that voted to leave are the same areas that have lost out from years of chronic underinvestment. Areas where too many people are held back by the lack of opportunities. Where people fail, the system is rigged against them. Because they can't get a decent, secure job, can't afford to buy a home, can't get more hours to retire, or aren't able to escape the spiral of debt. You can't replace secure jobs in manufacturing or mining with sport direct and insecure work like that. You've got to do better than that as a society and a country, and we're determined to do that. Labour's priority is to get the best Brexit deal for jobs and living standards, to underpin our plans to upgrade the economy and invest in every community and every region, to shift it away from the low-pay, low-skill, low-investment economy it's become under the Tories, and rebalance that investment across the whole of the country so that no longer will some regions get a mere 1/6 of the capital investment that goes to London. That's why Labour wants a Brexit for all our people, one that offers security to workers in the car industry worried about their future, hope to families struggling to pay the bills each month, and opportunity to young people wanting a decent job and a home of their own. These are the people we are thinking of and working for. It's a very different story around the away day mahogany table in Chequers. The government seems much more concerned about cutting deals with each other for their friends and their funders from the City of London. Labour is looking for a Brexit that puts the working people first. Leaving the EU, whatever that exit date comes, risks delivering a shock to the EU economy unless the right plans and protections are in place to allow the kind of investment and economic transformation programme that the country needs and that Labour is committed to. For 45 years, our economy has become increasingly linked to the European Union, and many of our laws and regulations set and monitored by joint European authorities, from implementing rules on the use of pesticides to assessing the levels of fluoride in our drinking water. The European Food Safety Authority plays a vital role in monitoring the substances used in manufacturing or growing our food, using the latest scientific evidence to assess whether substances are likely to have harmful effects on human or animal health. while the European Chemicals Agency carries out the vital task of evaluating and authorising chemicals as safe for use. And many businesses have supply chains and production processes interwoven throughout Europe. Take the UK car industry, which supports 169,000 manufacturing jobs, 52,000 of which are here in the West Midlands. If we look at the example of one of Britain's most iconic brands in this sector, let's look at the Mini. We begin to see how reliant our automotive industry is on a frictionless, interwoven supply chain. A Mini will cross the Channel 3 times in a 2,000-mile journey before the finished car rolls off the production line. Starting in Oxford, it will be shipped to France to be fitted for key components before being brought back to BMW's Hamshall plant in Warwickshire, where it is drilled and milled into shape. Once that process is complete, the Mini will be sent to Munich to be fitted with its engine, before ending its journey back at the Mini plant in Oxford for final assembly. If that car is to be sold on the continent, then many of its components will have crossed the Channel 4 times. The sheer complexity of these issues demand that we are practical and serious about this next stage. I want to pay tribute to Keir, Rebecca, Barry and Emily Thornberry, who are grappling with these issues. They are serious and united in their work. Now, I don't do personal in politics, but let me simply say this, it's in a bit of a contrast to what's going on the other side of the House of Commons chamber. I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to tread on difficult corns that people are suffering from. It makes no sense for the UK to abandon EU agencies and tariff-free trading rules that have served us well, supporting our industrial sectors, protecting workers and consumers, and safeguarding the environment. If that means negotiating to support individual EU agencies rather than paying more to duplicate those agencies here, then that should be an option, not something ruled out because of some phony jingoistic posturing by the Foreign Secretary. So we will want to remain a part of agencies like Euratom, regulating nuclear materials in energy and, crucially, in health sectors as well. And programmes like Erasmus, from which this university benefits greatly, with students from Britain studying across Europe and European students coming here to study. That enriches the lives of students on both sides of the Channel and all across the continent. It serves our interests, it serves the interests of young people all across Europe to maintain membership of Erasmus. We're leaving the European Union, but we're still working with European partners in the economic interests of this country. When 44% of our exports are to the EU countries and 50% of our imports come from the EU, then it's in both our interests for that trade to remain tariff-free. It would damage businesses that export to Europe and the jobs that depend on those exports for there to be the additional costs of tariffs. And it would damage consumers here, already failed by stagnant wages and rapidly rising housing costs. So, we will remain close to the EU, that's obvious. Every country, whether it's Turkey, Switzerland or Norway, that is geographically close to the EU without being an EU member state, has some sort of close relationship with the EU. They're some more advantageous than others, and Britain will need a bespoke, negotiated relationship of its own. During the transition period, which was proposed by Labour in the first place, Labour would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market. That means we would abide by the existing rules of both during transition. That is, so the government, businesses and workers only have to make one adjustment from the current situation to the final terms. Labour spelled out the need for a stable transition period last summer. Both the TUC and the CBI agree on that. We thought the government had accepted that case, but they now seem to be, very surprisingly, in disarray on this issue yet again. Time after time with this government, anything agreed at breakfast is being briefed against by lunch and abandoned by tea time. Disarray is, it seems, the new strong and stable. And the government's muddle and division risk the costly adjustments for both government and businesses, from the current terms to the transitional terms, and then again to the final terms. Labour would seek a final deal that gives full access to European markets and maintains the benefits of the single market and the customs union, as the Brexit Secretary David Davis promised in the House of Commons, with no new impediments to trade and no reduction in rights, standards and protections. We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland. But we're also clear that the option of a new UK customs union with the EU would need to ensure that the UK has a say in future trade deals. A new customs arrangement would depend on Britain being able to negotiate agreement for new trade deals in our national interest. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker. In contrast, the Conservative government has moved from saying it wanted trade with the EU after Brexit to be tariff-free to saying it wants it to be as tariff-free as possible, quite significant change. In which sectors of the economy and industry does the government think would be acceptable for there to be tariffs? They should let us know. Like with so much else, they haven't spelled that out 20 months after the referendum. But that is the consequence of ruling out the option of a customs union, which the government has done. So I appeal to MPs of all parties, be prepared to put the people's interests before the ideological fantasies, to join us in supporting the option of a new UK customs union with the EU that would give us a say in future trade deals. Labour respects the result of the referendum and Britain is leaving the EU, but we will not support any Tory deal that would do lasting damage to jobs, rights and living standards. Some seem very keen on downgrading our trading links with Europe. But we do not believe that deals with the US or China would be likely to compensate for a significant loss of trade with our neighbours in the European Union, and the government's own leaked assessments show exactly that. Both the United States and China have much weaker standards and regulation. Those deals would risk dragging Britain into a race to the bottom on vital protections and on rights at work. Environment, consumer and rights at work are pretty central to everything the Labour Party believes in. And, let me make this clear, we're implacably opposed to our National Health Service or any other public services being part of a trade deal with Trump's America or a revived transatlantic trade and investment partnership style deal with the EU, which would open the door to a flood of further privatisation of public services and our National Health Service. And we're not prepared to ask the British public to eat chlorinated chicken and lower the standards of British farming. We would ensure there will be no reduction in rights, standards or protections and instead seek to extend them. A deregulatory race to the bottom would damage people's jobs and living standards, and Labour would negotiate a new and strong relationship with the single market that includes full tariff-free access and a floor under existing rights, standards and protections. That new relationship would need to ensure we can deliver our ambitious economic programme, to take essential steps to intervene, upgrade and transform our economy, to build an economy for the 21st century that works for the many, not just the few. Labour has set out how we would create a national investment bank to drive investment in every community through a network of regional development banks, so that every area has an industrial strategy based on investment in a high-skill, high-wage, high-productivity economy. And through our $500 billion National Transformation Fund, we would invest in a decade-long programme of renewal so that Britain has the infrastructure that matches, if not exceeds, that of other major economies. In our transport networks, our energy markets and our digital infrastructure, too often Britain lags well behind. So we'd also seek to negotiate protections, clarifications or exemptions where necessary in relation to privatisation and public service competition directives, state aid and procurement rules and the Posted Workers Directive. We cannot be held back inside or outside the EU from taking the steps we need to support cutting-edge industries and local businesses and stop the tide of privatisation and outsourcing, or from preventing employers being able to import cheap agency labour to undercut existing pay and conditions and result in grotesque levels of exploitation of vulnerable workers and loss of jobs to others and huge profits to the employer in the middle of that. We would deal with that. It was alarming that after the Brexit vote, there was a clear rise in xenophobic and racist attacks on our streets. The referendum campaign was divisive, and some politicians on the Leave side whipped up fears and division in order to further their cause. That built on the shameful vans telling immigrants to go home, that the then Home Secretary instructed to trundle around the country, stirring up division. I remember just after the referendum result receiving a text from a young person in my constituency who'd been subjected to abuse in the street for the first time. First time in his life he'd been abused for what he is, and he was very afraid. Our immigration system will change, and freedom of movement will, as a statement of fact, end when we leave the EU. But we have also said that in the trade negotiations, our priorities are growth, jobs, and people's living standards. We make no apologies for putting those aims before bogus immigration targets. Labour will design our immigration policy around the needs of the economy based on fair rules and the reasonable management of migration. Every industry needs workers. There is a skill shortage in Britain, and our National Health Service is already suffering because large numbers of EU staff have gone home because they're frightened of the future in Britain. We want to turn that around. They're welcome to stay, welcome to work here, and we need their skills and we need their dedication to public service. And under Labour, we'll make sure that happens. We would not do what this government is doing and start from rigid red lines on immigration and then work out what that means for the economy afterwards. As Diane Abbott, our Shadow Home Secretary, set out last week, we do not begin with how do we reduce immigration and to hell with the consequences. These are Tory policies and Tory values. Part of the reason why net migration has been relatively high in recent years is because of the skills shortage in the UK labour market. At the general election, Labour set out plans to invest in a national education service with free college, university training places to tackle those shortages and not drive young people into debt just because they want to get a university education. But people also feel frustrated when they're denied opportunities to retrain or improve their skills, and employers instead import skilled labour from elsewhere. We will also restore free English as a second language courses so that people who come here, whether as migrants or refugees, can learn English and fully participate in their communities and workplaces. We also set out how we would tighten our labour market regulations and strengthen trade union rights to tackle the insecurity and exploitation of all workers. When migrant workers come to Britain, they must not be exploited or used to undercut or suppress better working conditions or higher pay. Those issues can only be tackled by stronger employment law, to stop employers being able to import cheap agency labour to undercut existing paying conditions. Collective agreements and sectoral bargaining must become the norm. Labour stands for the rate for the job, not a race to the bottom. But let's also be clear, it's not migrants that drive down wages. It's bad employers that cut pay and bad governments that allow workers to be divided and undermined. And they want unions to be weak and passive. We will strengthen our employment law, invest in the skills of workers in Britain so they can progress. And we will oppose all those who, instead of seeking to solve problems, seek to scapegoat instead. The devolution of the last Labour government completed the peace process in Northern Ireland, which we must cherish. The Good Friday Agreement was a great achievement, and I pay tribute to the work done by the Prime Minister, Tony Blair at the time, Mo Mowlam, and many others who worked so hard on all sides in Northern Ireland to secure that agreement. We must continue to support the restoration of the Northern Ireland Assembly and to ensure we maintain the situation of no hard border in Northern Ireland. The previous Labour government also brought powers closer to home in Scotland and Wales, establishing the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. And so Labour believes that powers over devolved policy areas currently exercised by the EU should go directly to the relevant body devolved after Brexit. So that power is closer to the people. That is the same principle that informs the regional development banks that the next Labour government will deliver. The constitution of the Labour Party includes a commitment to support the United Nations, a promise, and I quote, to secure peace, freedom, democracy, economic security and environmental protection for all. Some want to use Brexit to turn Britain on itself, seeing everyone as a feared competitor. Others want to use Brexit to put rocket boosters under our current economic system's insecurities and inequalities, turning Britain into a deregulated corporate tax haven with low wages, limited rights and cut-price public services in what would be a destructive race to the bottom. Labour stands for a completely different future, drawing on the best internationalist traditions of the labour movement and of this country. We want to see close cooperative relations with our European neighbours outside the EU, based on our values of internationalism, solidarity and equality, as well as mutual benefit and fair trade. We're proud that Britain was an original signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights in 1948, and in 1998, Labour's Human Rights Act enshrined that in law. So Labour will continue to work with other European allies, including through the Council of Europe, to ensure our country and others uphold our international obligation. We must work with other countries to advance the cause of human rights, to confront the four greatest and interconnected threats facing our common humanity. First, the growing concentration of unaccountable wealth and power in the hands of a tiny global corporate elite. We must challenge that, working with our European neighbours to stop those who would play one country off against another, or those who hide their wealth offshore in order to avoid paying their dues to fund the public services that they all use at some point in their lives. The second, climate change, which is creating instability and fueling conflict across the world and threatening all our futures. No matter how much we inform them, pollution stubbornly, very disrespectfully, refuses to respect national borders. We can only tackle climate change, pollution and environmental degradation by working together, and many of our closest allies in that struggle are in Europe. The Green Alliance estimates that trade in low-carbon goods and services contributed over $42 billion to the economy in 2015. The UK low-carbon and renewable energy sector was expected to increase fivefold by 2030, potentially bringing 2 million jobs and contributing more than 8% to UK's national output. But that needs us to maintain our standards and ensure barrier-free trade in low-carbon goods. Those include eco-design and energy labelling standards, greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles, and internal energy market construction product standards, chemical regulation, and nuclear safety and safeguards. So the importance of getting our Brexit settlement right is vital in this area, both in terms of Britain's industrial role in reducing climate change and in terms of protecting jobs and industry. Thirdly, there are unprecedented numbers of people fleeing conflict, persecution, human rights abuses, social breakdown, and climate disaster. The global refugee crisis is huge, and there are 65 million refugees across the world. That's the equivalent of the entire population of Britain. That crisis is a challenge, much of which is on the borders of Europe. And that challenge can be met by coordinating with neighbours, both to crack down on people smugglers who put men, women and children at sea in unseaworthy vessels, as Operation Sophia tried to rescue those from the seas around Europe, as too many desperate people are drowning in pursuit of sanctuary. These are people who are simply seeking refuge from cruelty and suffering. They want to make a contribution, but for accident of birth, it could be any of us. Let's have the hand of humanity to refugees around the world, not blame them for the problems that they're fleeing from. And I pay tribute, too, to the role the Royal Navy's played in their contribution in the Mediterranean, in saving lives and plucking people from danger in the sea. And finally, I want to briefly address the use of unilateral military action and intervention rather than diplomacy and negotiation to resolve disputes and change governments. Let's learn the lessons of Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan and be clear that we will not take our country down the road of regime change wars again. The real answer is genuine international cooperation, which confronts the root causes of conflict, persecution and inequality. And we will continue to play a role in partnership with the EU in that effort. We live in a globalised world. The lives we lead are dependent on the work of others and our trade with those from around the world. Many of us have friends and family that are from or who live in many other parts of the world. In contrast to the Prime Minister who said, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. We believe, in fact, that we can only fully achieve what we want to as citizens of Britain by also recognising we are citizens of the world. I have long opposed embedding of free market orthodoxy and the democratic deficit in the European Union. That's why I campaign to remain and reform in the referendum. Scepticism is healthy, especially when dealing with politicians, and there's plenty of them here today, or the received wisdom of the political and media establishment, and there's plenty of those here today as well. But often the term Eurosceptic in reality became synonymous with anti-European. And I'm not anti-European at all. I want to see close, progressive cooperation with the whole of Europe after Brexit. Labour is the party of the new common sense on the economy, on public services and on Brexit. The only party which recognises the world has changed these last 10 years. And no, we cannot continue with widening inequality, deregulation of industry and privatisation of public services. We're in a country where Tory-run councils are collapsing because of cuts, where homeless people are dying on the streets in the shadow of Parliament, where good jobs are being lost. We've got a government that will not get a grip on the casino economy. In or out of the European Union, we have to deal with that reality, the reality of market failure and of austerity. The free market has not worked in the banking sector. It's not worked in the water industry. It's not worked in the energy utilities, and it has crashed in outsourcing. It's failed our fragmented railways, and it has led to a labour market where abuse is rife. The European Union is not the root of all our problems, and leaving it will not solve all our problems. Likewise, the EU is not the source of all enlightenment, and leaving it does not inevitably spell doom. There'll be some who will tell you Brexit is a disaster for this country, and some will tell you that Brexit will create a land of milk and honey. The truth is more down to earth, and it's in our hands. Brexit is what we make of it, together. The priorities and choices we make in negotiations. The Conservative government is damaging our country, and their priorities for Brexit risk increasing and exacerbating that damage. But I also know what a Labour government could do for this country, and that our priorities for Brexit negotiations are the right ones. To create a country that works, really does work, for the many, not the few. Thank you very much.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn there, setting out Labour's policy on Brexit. The first time we've seen real clear water between Labour and the Conservatives. Him saying that he would wish to stay within a customs union, and at the same time the Prime Minister's spokesperson saying that the Conservatives do not wish to stay within a customs union. We're expecting to take questions from the floor, so let's listen back in.
Now, I'll do them in groups, and we should have some roving mics around the room. I think we've got 2 on the go at the moment. So I'll start on this side. Gentleman with the red tie and the glasses. Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News. If you went into a customs agreement, the say you have may just be a right to be heard, not a right to a vote, not a right to a veto. Would you live with that? And can I just ask one other, because you pointed out...
Say that again.
Sorry. You might just have... is it the microphone, or is it?
Yes.
Is that better? Customs agreement, you might just have a right to be heard, not a right to a vote or a veto on any trade agreements that the EU might have. Could you live with that? And just one other, if I may. You pointed out it's been 20 months since the referendum, and you say the Tories have been playing politics. Why have you suddenly now come round to the idea of a customs agreement? Some people might think you've got a political game on your mind.
Do another 2. Got the lady sat down with the blue dress on, just a little bit further along.
Thank you. Anushka Astana from The Guardian. A QC, George Peretz, has pointed out this morning that a number of European countries spend more on state aid per head than the UK does, and also that Scandinavian-style economies are obviously possible within the single market because they exist. What specific Labour policies do you hope to implement that you believe requires an exemption from those single market rules?
We'll do one more from this side. The gentleman with the blue tie and the lovely blue jumper there.
Thank you very much. Nick Watt, BBC Newsnight. Mr Corbyn, it's often said that because we don't see you at these set-piece interventions on Brexit very often, that you're keen for Theresa May to own Brexit's success or failure. And yet in the last week, you raised it at Prime Minister's questions, and here we are today. And I'm just wondering, do you see an opportunity to shape Brexit or an opportunity to ship out Theresa May?
Well, I love your blue sweater. It's very nice. We have a team. I know it's a bit of a difficult concept for the Tory party to understand. We actually have a team. It's called the Shadow Cabinet. It's called our Brexit negotiating team, and we've travelled far and wide. I've travelled over many parts of Europe. I've maintained a very close relationship with colleagues from the Party of European Socialists and developed that understanding because we want an alliance with them in the future. Indeed, I think I've attended more meetings of the Party of European Socialists than any Labour leader in the past. And our team is obviously part of that. I did raise these matters with the Prime Minister at question time last week, as you know, and you'd heard all of that. And we will continue making these interventions. Listen, it was only 2 weeks or so after the referendum in 2016 that Andy Burnham, who was then our Shadow Home Secretary, before he went on to become the Mayor of Greater Manchester, proposed an amendment to Parliament, or a resolution to Parliament, which would guarantee EU citizens their rights of residence in Britain. We've been on this from the very, very beginning of trying to deal with the consequences of the decision the British people handed to us. On the points that Anushka raised from The Guardian, the issues are of competition rules and the issues are of the rules on state aid. And, for example, the nationalisation of RBS, in order to accommodate European rules, was accompanied by the selling off of some of the best parts of RBS, and the public was left with the remainder. Royal Mail is a natural monopoly. Mail delivery is a natural monopoly. I do not agree with or accept the idea there has to be competition in mail delivery. After all, we all have one letterbox, and it's much more efficient to have one postal delivery person coming down the street rather than 3 or 4 from different or competing companies. And likewise, the idea of sort of competition in water supply is a little odd when there's only one water pipe comes to each house. So the idea that the competition rules work for the benefit of all is, we do not believe to be the case, and we set out very clear in our manifesto, which did receive a huge degree of support, was public ownership of water and mail, and also of train operating companies. On the point raised by Channel 4, I've set it out in the speech what we want to achieve. What we're going to achieve is our right to be able to negotiate and consult at the same time with the European Union on the sort of trade agreements that we make, and also to influence them on the sort of trade deals that are made with the rest of the world. For example, EU trade agreements at the moment have a human rights clause in them, very seldom enforced. They also have what I hope would be much stronger clauses on workers' rights and opportunities in third world countries or non-European countries from which goods are imported. I would want to see those things stronger, and the Labour government would be committed to making those things stronger. Does that mean we have to be passive takers? No. We are a large economy, we are an important part of the world trade system, and we would obviously negotiate to achieve that. Barry has set this out very clearly in many debates in Parliament.
I have a second question. What took you so long? Some people might think you want to play politics now with this issue.
Well, that's a really strange question, because I, as you know, spend a lot of time travelling around the country doing campaigning meetings. The issues surrounding Brexit come up all the time, and we thought it would be helpful if, as the second stage of negotiation beginning, we set out our views here today, which is exactly what we're doing. And thank you for coming along.
Okay, any more questions? We've got a lady in a blue dress down there.
You mentioned, hi, I'm Polly from Free Radio News. You mentioned about the automotive industry in Coventry. Jaguar Land Rover said last week that they would suffer dire consequences from the impact of Brexit, and thousands having to pay for it with their jobs. First of all, what do you say to that? And second of all, would your plan then reassure them of those fears?
I'll do another 2. Got the gentleman behind with the fetching scarf on there.
Thank you. Ben Kentish, The Independent. Mr Corbyn, you talked again today about the need to maintain a soft border in Northern Ireland. You admitted that staying in the customs union will only help that aim. The EU said repeatedly that the only way to guarantee that there's not a hard border is to stay in the single market. If it comes down to it and that does prove to be the case, are you saying they're wrong on that, or would you countenance leaving on the table the option of staying in the single market?
We've got a gentleman just on the little bit further back with the beard, trendy beard there.
Hi, Charlie Cooper from Politico. There was a new campaign group formed a few weeks ago called Our Future, Our Choice. It's a youth campaign group, and their main purpose is to persuade you, Mr Corbyn, to back a second referendum on membership of the EU. You believe in the power of grassroots campaigns to change minds. Is there any chance they could ever change your mind on this?
On the question of jobs here in Coventry, yes, Coventry is a manufacturing centre, is a research centre, and is part of the whole West Midlands industrial strength. And clearly that relies very, very heavily on trade with Europe, as this university relies on overseas students, not just from Europe, but from all over. And I want to obviously protect those jobs and to ensure that the universities can carry on recruiting large numbers of overseas students. But likewise, I also want to make sure that UK students don't go into debt in order to get an education. So our proposals here are that we have that effective trading relationship with Europe, and I think what we've said here today ought to be good news for the people in Coventry and on the West Midlands. On the question of the border with Northern Ireland, we are very, very clear that the Good Friday Agreement was a huge, enormous step forward in which both traditions in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland were respected, and that historical movement came because of very brave people being prepared to talk and negotiate about it, and it came about. Nobody wants to lose that, and indeed every meeting I've been to in Brussels or anywhere else, the Northern Ireland border issue does come up. That means there has to be a customs union that guarantees there is no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and that's our priority. We've made that very, very clear time and time again. On the question of decision on the outcome, what we've pushed for is a number of red lines in the House of Commons, one of which is the points that Keir Starmer has made many, many times, that there should be a meaningful vote in Parliament on the final deal, as indeed there will be a decision made by the 27 member states in the European Union plus the European Parliament. And so there's an awful lot of discussion and negotiation to go on. We're not doing the negotiations, but we are setting out what we would do. And if we were in office, the priorities we would make. We are not proposing a second referendum. What we're proposing is the final meaningful vote in Parliament.
So let's mix it up a bit now. Have we got any non-journalists who want to ask Jeremy a question in the audience?
Anyone on the mobile phone is a journalist?
I'll pick a lady. We've got a lady with the blonde hair, second row.
I want to say, please, will you hurry up and be our Prime Minister?
Yay. Okay, we've got time for another 2 questions then. Gentleman with the blue shirt sat a couple of rows back there. Standing up now.
Following on from that, Andy Bell, 5 News. Mr. Corbyn. Sorry, following on from that, with this new shift in policy, is it your hope, your intention, that Labour MPs will now be able to join with Conservative rebels, defeat the government in Parliament, and maybe precipitate an election?
One more before we go home. I'll go to this side. Gentleman there with the coat on and the glasses and the beard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. In Coventry, we've got an issue, probably so up and down the country, the police shortage on the streets. Certainly my ward, which I represent, Binley and Willenhall, there has been a meetings with residents and so on. I think it's up and down the country. Police is starving of the resources. Is there any possibility Labour government can look into it and make sure there's adequate policing on the street and there's no vigilantes on the streets?
Thanks for that, the last question. I'll answer the other 2 as well. We are pledged to increase police numbers by 10,000, or put 10,000 more police officers there. I was with David Jameson on Saturday in Stourbridge, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner, and I was talking to police officers and the community there. They're losing their PCSOs. Other parts of the country are also losing their PCSOs. So that sense of community cooperation between the police and local citizens is lost, and the police only then come in when there's a dire emergency or a major crime. That is not a good way forward. If we're to deal with issues of antisocial behaviour, of low-level abuse, of higher-level abuse, of knife crime and really serious issues like that. You don't achieve it by reducing police numbers. You can't solve it all on a computer in a desk somewhere. It's only achieved by PCSOs who understand the community and out on the streets. I spent part of last week, I was in Great Yarmouth, and I spent a while talking to two local police officers who'd both been on the same area for 10 years. They knew everybody in the community. They knew all the strains and stresses, and they were able to relate to that community, and the community related to them. So they could help. And the points they all made, everybody makes all the time, was if you cut police numbers, you close youth clubs, you dismiss youth workers, you reduce the availability of community centres, recreational facilities, of sports facilities and everything else, is it very surprising you end up with more and more antisocial behaviour and more levels of crime? We're saying it's a false economy to cut police numbers and PCSO numbers. What we would do is invest in the community infrastructure that's provided by youth workers and community centres and all those. That's why we're fighting the local elections, and that's why austerity is so wrong. Andy, thanks for your question. Look, we're putting our views to Parliament. We are not in a majority. We have the result we got in the general election, and we are determined to win the next general election whenever that comes. We're fighting to protect jobs, to protect living standards, consumer rights, environmental living standards, and above all, the rights that people have at work. And I've tried to set out what I believe to be a more global view of our place in the world than that which the Tories do. There is no future in turning this country into some sort of xenophobic offshore island that just sees everybody as a threat or a rival. No! We're an open, multicultural, multilingual society. Let's be proud of that, proud of what we've achieved, but above all, say to people in every community, in every part of the country, a Labour government will not let your industries disappear and be replaced by nothing other than short-term, insecure, zero-hours contract type work. We are serious, very serious, about investing in every community in the country. Surely the political class should learn a lesson from the results of the referendum, was that sense of anger at left-behind communities anywhere in Britain. We will not walk by on the other side and let towns and cities die for the lack of investment. It's our duty to achieve something very different and very better. And yes, we're campaigning very hard all over the country to win the local elections and then a general election when it comes, and so you'll get a Labour government that way. Is that OK?
Back to wherever it is you're headed now. And if you haven't been able to ask a question, then please don't hesitate to contact either myself, Kia, or Barry, or indeed Jeremy's office throughout the course of the day, and we'll do our best to deal with any queries that come in. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Well, there we have the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, speaking at the National Transport and Design Centre in Coventry, setting out Labour's vision for Brexit, putting clear blue water between him and the government, saying that he believes that a customs union is a viable option, new, comprehensive, no tariffs with Europe, and also the need for no hard border with Northern Ireland. But it wouldn't be the customs union, as we have it at the moment. It would be a newly negotiated customs union, and also staying in a customs union, and also the single market as well. Well, let's get some reaction to that speech. Let's talk to Mary Craig. Oh, let's talk to Faisal Islam first of all. Our political editor, Faisal Islam, is down there. Faisal, whilst Jeremy Corbyn was speaking, we had response from the Prime Minister saying that they will not be staying in a customs union. So, for the first time possibly now, we have a bit of clarity between the Labour Party and between the Conservatives, two different directions that they are taking Brexit.
Yep, clear decision now, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually the government is actually legislating with the words "our customs union" in its legislation, in the customs bill and the trade bill. It's there. And so what's happened, and I asked the Prime Minister specifically this question in China, and at that point they weren't willing to ask it because a customs union was within the realms, not the most likely outcome of a negotiation the government is going for, but it wasn't ruled out. It was ruled out in the past few weeks after pressure from Jacob Rees-Mogg and the European Research Group. What we're seeing here, essentially, is Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party trying to move into territory recently vacated by the Conservatives on the idea of a customs union. And the reason for that, says Jeremy Corbyn, is twofold. It's essentially, he's doing the selfies and everything, just so you can't quite see that, is the car industry and its just-in-time supply chains that see cars floating, traded across the channel, the parts flying around multiple times, but it's also about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, the first reason cited by Jeremy Corbyn for why he will seek a comprehensive customs union to replace the customs union the United Kingdom will leave upon Brexit. Now, what he said, where people will see some analogies with the government's approach, what some have termed the kind of cake and eat it approach, is that he wants to be part of this new customs union, but at the same time have the ability to influence and have a say over the trade deals that the EU would then complete or newly do after we leave. There's no sense in which we can see that the EU are going for that. It's not something that's currently offered Turkey, which is the nearest analogy. He thinks he can have the Turkey model and a lot more. And then there's this open question too about the single market, because you can't in a way just be in the customs union. In order to make the customs union function and work and be truly kind of borderless and frictionless, you also need to be part of elements of the single market. He showed some hints of that, saying that they would remain members of some of the agencies like the Chemicals Agency, the Nuclear Agency, Euratom, the Pharmaceutical Agency, the Food Standards Agency. All of those have European Court of Justice jurisdiction. That is a red line for the Conservatives and for Theresa May, not a red line for the Labour Party. So they feel perfectly at ease saying we can do this, also saying, we're not that bothered about these new free trade deals that the Conservatives and UKIP are excited about from their perspective. I mean, essentially it's a judgment about a place like this, Coventry, that has a big automotive sector but voted leave. His gamble is this, that people that voted leave, particularly Labour supporters that voted leave, are happy to leave the institutions of the European Union, but when push comes to shove, won't be tempted over by the Conservative and Prime Minister's rhetoric that means total freedom to do free trade deals. He's saying frictionless trade is more important. He's saying the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement is more important. It sets up quite the battle. We get more information from the EU on Northern Ireland on Wednesday, the Prime Ministerial speech on Friday too. And you do get this sense, though, he feels he can do a better negotiation than the Prime Minister. Where's he getting that confidence from? Is there a kind of shadow negotiation here going on from the shadow cabinet to Brussels? They do meet. That's what he thinks, but played down the idea of a kind of a general election coming up if Tory MPs vote with him. I think it makes it a little bit more difficult for some of those Tory MP rebels, given how much Jeremy Corbyn has made of that, and that is surely the message the whips will put back. But yes, you're right, we do have some clear blue water, but we have some of the same approach too in expecting a certain type of negotiation out of Brussels that has not been forthcoming so far.
OK, Faisal, thanks very much for that.
Anyway, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has been making his big speech on Brexit this morning, and he was keen to try to set out some clear red water between his position and that of the government. While the Prime Minister has insisted the UK will leave the customs union, allowing it to negotiate its own post-Brexit trade deals, Mr Corbyn has confirmed that Labour will in fact back a customs union with the EU. The Labour leader also said his party would, if it had the opportunity, negotiate a new and strong relationship with the single market. Some Brexit-backing Labour MPs have warned that the party risks betraying those who voted to take back control of immigration and laws, although the speech may have pleased the many more Labour MPs who support a closer relationship with the EU. Let's have a listen to Mr Corbyn speaking earlier.
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker. The European Union is not the root of all our problems, and leaving it will not solve all our problems. Likewise, the EU is not the source of all enlightenment, and leaving it does not inevitably spell doom. There will be some who will tell you Brexit is a disaster for this country, and some will tell you that Brexit will create a land of milk and honey. The truth is more down to earth, and it's in our hands. Brexit is what we make of it, together. The priorities and choices we make in negotiations.
Jeremy Corbyn speaking a little earlier. And joining us now from Coventry is the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Rebecca, Labour says Britain will need a bespoke relationship of its own, that you'd seek to negotiate protections, clarifications or exemptions where necessary in order to deliver on your ambitious economic programme. So to sum up, you want all the good bits of the single market and none of the allegedly bad bits, which I think the EU calls cherry-picking, and they've rejected.
Well, no, I think there are certain provisions that we know undermine our workers' rights. For example, the Swedish derogation, the posted workers directives, is not in the interest of workers here in Britain, and we would want to seek that exemption. We know that a number of EU countries are currently pressing for it to be removed, and if it isn't removed, we will be pushing ahead with that. But ultimately, the message that Jeremy put forward today was that we have domestic economic problems, deep structural problems within our economy that need to be addressed. We've had significant underinvestment in particular regions over the last 7 years, and people are increasingly making their voice heard that they're not happy with this economic model. Now, we can put in place domestic interventions, and we've said that we'll do that. We're undertaking the most radical and robust industrial programme that's seen a generation in terms of investing in our infrastructure, our skills, our research and development, for example. But that will only work if we have a solid relationship with the EU that supports and complements our industrial strategy and our economic programme going forward.
Right, so what evidence do you have that the EU would agree to all of that? I mean, this really is, as you said once, having your cake and eating it. We want to maintain the benefits that we currently have within the customs union. We want to have our cake and eat it, as do most parties in Westminster. So where's the evidence that the EU would agree to that whole long list of the domestic policies you want to enact while still retaining all the benefits of the customs union and the single market?
Well, look, we've been clear from the start that people didn't vote to leave the European Union in order to have worse terms and conditions, to have lower rates of pay. We're always going to fight for a Brexit that puts our economy, jobs and businesses first, and that's what we set out to do. Now, we know that we're in a strong negotiating position with the EU. We're one of their strongest partners. We're the 6th richest economy in the world. Why would they not want to negotiate a bespoke deal with us in the same way that they've negotiated bespoke deals with other countries around Europe?
So do you think then that the government has an equally strong hand when negotiating its position on the basis that you've just outlined?
Well, the government doesn't have a strong position at all. They can't decide what they're doing from one week to the next. I mean, even in terms of the transition period, for example, they can't agree whether we're going to have existing terms or whether we're going to negotiate a transition period. And we've been quite clear today. So, for example, in relation to the transition period, we'll observe the current terms and conditions of the customs union and the single market so that we're not pushing businesses and workers off a cliff edge, and they're not having to undertake a new set of rules and regulations and then have to do it again once the final deal is reached. We want to provide certainty, and we know that that is not what this government is doing at the moment.
But you still haven't been able to tell us
long-term investment decisions.
Right, you still haven't been able to. You still haven't been able to tell us why your position would be any stronger than the government's. There was a plan that came out of the Chequers meeting with 4 points that then Donald Tusk from the European Union Council rejected as cherry-picking. You're saying that by remaining part of a customs union, that our trade policy will be dictated by the EU 27. Do you accept that?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear that.
Do you accept that our trade policy will be dictated by the EU 27 if the UK is part of a customs union with the...
No, and we've been very clear on that today. What we're seeking to achieve is to become part of a customs union with the EU, but that will be dependent on there being a clear forum in which Britain has a very, very strong position in agreeing to or amending any trade deals itself.
But what's your evidence that the EU would sign up? But there's no evidence, Rebecca Long-Bailey, that the EU would sign up to those exemptions, clarifications and protections that you talk about.
Well, we're in a very strong position for the reasons that I set out earlier. We're one of the biggest economies in the world. The EU wants to have a positive relationship with us, as we want to have a positive relationship with them. And we know that we are only going to work as an economy and a European economy as a whole if we forge that strong relationship together.
Right, but you've just said that the British government hasn't got a clear direction, although it's stated what it wants to do in terms of leaving the customs union. Well, except they've said they want to leave the customs union and the right, but they've said they want to leave the customs union and the single market, which is pretty clear. And even some of the things that they would like to see done in a bespoke deal have been rejected by the EU. So I say to you again, you say you're in a strong position, but there's no evidence for that strong position. Why do you think but hang on, why do you think you can have the same relationship as Britain currently has now, but somehow give the UK a voice that's more influential than each of the EU 27, that we'd be able to influence EU trade policy more than them?
Well, we're taking a reasonable and pragmatic view of our future relationship with the EU. The government has not been reasonable and pragmatic. They say they want to have frictionless trade. They say they don't want a hard border in Northern Ireland, and yet they refuse to accept that we must have some form of customs union with the European Union. We realise that we can't have that frictionless trade without some form of a customs union, and that's what we're taking to the negotiating table. But we also want to be perfectly clear that we're not going to be a passive recipient in that arrangement. We want there to be a forum, a clear forum where Britain has the opportunity to argue and fight for its future trade deals on appropriate terms that are in the benefit of our own economic interests.
Isn't this just the first step of you ratting, as your colleague Frank Field said, on all those Labour levers? They voted to take back control of the money, of borders and of laws, and you'd sell them down the river to get Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street.
No. This is about taking back control and ensuring that we have full economic control. But to do that,
well, you can't if you're part of a customs union.
No, we have to make sure that we have a positive relationship with the EU in order to do that. We can't sell out our industrial base. We can't make people worse off than they are now on leaving the European Union. We have to find a relationship that satisfies our desire to leave the European Union, but also make sure that we can maintain those positive trading relationships and other relationships within the European Union. That's what we've set out today.
Will you back Anna Soubry's amendment to enable the UK to stay in a customs union and potentially defeat the government?
Well, we'll take that decision throughout the course of this week based on what the government comes back with. It'll be interesting to see what interventions they make today. As we know, they're at war with each other on the issue of the customs union, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some movement on that very point. Let's hope so anyway.
And on immigration, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn said today that Labour would design immigration policy around need of economy based on fair rules and reasonable management of migration, and make no apologies for putting those aims before bogus immigration targets. Are you committed to ending freedom of movement?
Well, freedom of movement will end, that's a fact,
right,
when we leave the European Union. So we have to have a fair and reasonable system in place. Now, that system has to address our economic needs. It has to fill skills gaps and shortages. We have organisations such as the CBI and the British Chamber of Commerce calling for clear guidelines and rules in relation to this to make sure that we can make sure that industry gets the skills that they need. But we've also got to address an underlying issue that we've got within Britain, that we've had chronic underinvestment in our own homegrown skills and talent. 1.15 billion was cut from the adult skills budget, for example, in recent years. So we have to make sure that we're skilling up people who currently live here in Britain, whilst also addressing the overall skills deficit that we might have by making sure that we have a pool of talent ready to take place in our industry.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you. Well, we're joined here in the studio by the UKIP MEP and prominent Brexit campaigner Nigel Farage. Nigel, what did you make of Jeremy Corbyn's speech? Is it a game changer?
It's the first step of a, I think, quite easy to see complete Labour sellout on the SCM. It's perfectly clear. I mean, the nonsense about trade. Governments don't negotiate trade deals. The European Commission negotiate trade deals. So if you're part of a customs union, you will not be involved in that. So they've given up on that. And what Barnier will say is, well, thank you very much. That's great. We're very happy with this. But you now need to go further on the single market. So the next big Labour speech on this a few months down the road will be, that we'll be inextricably linked to a single market, but not the single market. I thought the biggest clue of the lot was yesterday on the BBC when Starmer said, we will have to have a new treaty. So we get rid of the current treaty, we have another treaty, and Labour voters are going to start to ask, are we really leaving?
Lisa and Andy, would you like to see Labour commit to remaining members of the single market?
I think, broadly speaking, we're in exactly the right place for the country.
But what about the answer to that question?
Well, that is the answer to that question, is that the position that Jeremy just set out about an hour ago was building on the commitment that Keir made yesterday about a customs union rather than the customs union, access to the single market rather than membership of the single market.
Well, we can all have access to the single market.
Because, as Rebecca outlined, it gives you flexibility to be able to negotiate specific terms, rules and agreements that you want to sign up to and those that you don't. I mean, for me, the importance of all of this that is being lost in all the sort of bluster and hot air is that Labour does now have a very clear position, which is that we see our future as being a high-wage, high-standard, high-quality economy that links us very closely, pegs us very closely to those standards that operate across the European Union.
Right, but Labour's policy would mean Britain would be a rule taker, and you accept that, and that is where you would be selling levers down the line.
No, that's part of the negotiation. And the difficulty for Britain is that there isn't that agreement within the Tory party, even within the Cabinet. So, you know, the question is, because this is a choice, really, in the end, is do we want to peg ourselves very closely to countries like the US and China and trade on those terms, which will push down wages in constituencies like mine, or do we want to peg ourselves much more closely to the EU?
Sorry,
Nigel.
Was open door immigration,
you've had quite a lot to say about the
I'm going to come to you on immigration in a moment. Let me come to Chris Gibble. What do you say to that? I mean, are you confident that you will still be able to get Parliament to endorse leaving the single market and the customs union?
Well, I think, first of all, this is about taking back control. People voted in June 2016 to have control over their money, their laws and their borders, and that 2/3 of Labour constituencies voted to leave. They will be outraged if they feel that our future trade policy is going to be set by the EU. The whole point of having a customs union...
No, that's not true.
The whole point of having a customs union means that it will exclude the ability for Britain to be able to sign independently up to the trade terms it wishes to do so. And when people realise that, you know, when people realise that a customs union will lead to this, I think there's going to be serious consequences to the Labour Party of eroding its base.
Right. I mean, Nigel Farage, your party got just under 600,000 votes in the last election. That's against 17.4 million people who voted to leave, as well as all of those, of course, who voted to remain. Why do you still get to define what a proper Brexit looks like?
Nah, look, the party got very few votes because the public believed, parties like Labour, that actually the Brexit they voted for was going to happen. And now, a few months down the road, we're seeing a very different picture. There are 4 million plus Labour voters who voted for Corbyn, who genuinely want immigration reduced significantly and want us to leave the single market, the customs union, and to be an independent country. So this is a sellout by any measure. You know, I mean,
but you've always said that Jeremy Corbyn was a Brexiteer. Why wouldn't people trust him to deliver the sort of Brexit that will protect jobs and the economy, as he has stated?
Well, because, as I say, if we continue with free movement, he's made it pretty clear this morning...
They said an end to free movement.
Well, he said he wants to be a citizen of the world. He said we won't scapegoat anybody. I mean, there were so many references there. And he also said Labour's priority will be business commitments, not arbitrary migration numbers. So all this will continue, and we will, low-paid jobs. No, that's right, and that's what Labour have produced for us over the years.
Let Lisa respond.
Well, just, you know, this is absolute nonsense. If it was as true as you say, that you somehow magically know exactly why every single Leave voter in this country voted to leave, and the specific legal mechanisms that they want to see in place afterwards, then why did your vote collapse in constituencies like mine in 2017?
Because
we stood on a very clear manifesto that said we wanted a high-wage, high-quality economy. We didn't, though. We didn't. We stood on a very clear commitment that said that we wanted to retain the benefits of the single market. We wanted access to the single market. We wanted to avoid a hard border with Northern Ireland.
All right, we'll come on to that hard border. We will come to the hard border.
As much as it does to people in Northern Ireland.
Let's just talk about immigration. What do you understand by Rebecca Long-Bailey and what was said in the Labour manifesto, that there will be an end to freedom of movement, which is then followed by a new system, a fairer system, says Jeremy Corbyn, of managed migration?
Well, I'm not part of the discussion internally behind the scenes.
But what does it mean to you?
What I imagine that this would mean, and where I imagine this is leading to, whether it's Tories negotiating it or Labour, is probably a system that looks a lot like work permits and visas, looking at the requirements to bring in skilled labour and non-skilled labour.
And with the numbers coming down or not?
Like the agricultural industry. Well, I think that's a bit of a red herring, to be honest, because if you start saying we'll set some kind of arbitrary target for numbers, then you're not looking at the interests of the economy.
Right. I mean, in terms of knowing what people actually wanted about leaving the European Union, are you saying that there are going to be tens of thousands of very disappointed Labour leavers that we're not going to be leaving the customs union if Labour...
No, millions. Millions of Labour voters, very disappointed. I mean, this actually is the Conservative Party's big chance. If the Conservative Party, if Theresa May was able, right now, to grab the immigration agenda, I think she could do massive damage to Labour in the Midlands and the North. I'm not sure whether she'll do it, but everybody was clear. We were voting to leave the institutions of the European Union and run our own lives.
Nobody voted for lower wages.
That is what. Well, they're going to get higher. Well, actually, they're going to get higher wages if we control immigration.
Right.
And if we go global, we could be a richer country. What you've done today, you've stopped us going global by staying part of a customs union.
Right, and that does mean, I mean, you say it would be in a negotiation, but it does mean on paper that Britain would remain a rule taker if we are part of a customs union. There wouldn't be the ability to negotiate free trade agreements in the way that people envisaged, and that is going back on what was promised in the referendum.
No, there would be restrictions on the way in which we could negotiate free trade agreements, but it wouldn't prevent us from negotiating.
Well, except on the basis of being friendlier to the EU and being friendly in negotiations is not evidence for saying that the EU would give you what you want.
No, but what it would entail, as Keir rightly was honest about yesterday, is that we would have to work very closely with other European countries in order to negotiate free trade agreements. Now, the truth is... Sorry, Nigel, you've had a lot to say about this, most of it nonsense.
Let her finish and I'll come back to you.
And the truth is...
You're not telling the truth.
You're not telling the truth.
The European Commission negotiates
You've had
the
a lot
EU's
to
trade
say.
deals.
You've
not
said
one
that.
word of it. Not one word of it has been true. It's nonsense.
For 40 years that's
and
been the case.
The truth is that this is a choice in the end about what sort of country we want to be. We cannot be simultaneously a high-wage, high-regulation economy and a low-wage, low-regulation economy. We have to choose if we want a close trading relationship with Europe or not, and that's where neither of these political parties is being honest with the British public.
Before I come to you, one of the other issues is about state aid, which is an important cornerstone of what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do if he becomes Prime Minister in terms of economic policy. Labour wants to undermine the principle of no state aid, which is a principle that is crucial to the internal EU market. Why and how?
Well, actually, I disagree with that, and I slightly disagree with Rebecca in the way that it was characterised in that interview, because the truth is that if you look at countries like France, it is just simply not true to say that remaining within the European Union is a barrier to state aid. And in
so that's a straw man put up by the Labour Party?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's a genuine fear, but one that is actually, in my view, not fully borne out by the facts. I think it is possible to remain within the European Union. Not that we're leaving, but it is possible to do that and intervene in markets. So I don't think that that is a consideration that should determine any political party's policy.
Nigel Farage, you were stating very clearly earlier that the Commission is the one that is negotiating here. But it's also true to say that other countries have had bespoke deals. I mean, if you look at Turkey with regard to the customs union, or you look at Switzerland with regard to bilaterals...
We were talking in the context there, Joe, of doing trade deals with the rest of the world. And it is the European Commission that does that. Actually, even as members of the European Union governments don't have that much say over it. So you cannot be in a customs union and exert very much influence on outside trade policy. That's a fact. However, I think what is very, very interesting, there's one thing for certain if we stay in a customs union: food will stay expensive, because the other thing that a customs union does, it determines the tariffs that are put on imports from the rest of the world on items like shoes, food, bras, the things actually that the poorest families spend the biggest part of their incomes on. Those things will stay expensive if we stay in a customs union, and that's something that Labour voters need to understand.
What do you say to that? Because it was also a line from Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Tory MP.
But essentially what Nigel's arguing for is a vision of Britain in which wages in constituencies like mine fall, and that means that, relatively speaking, prices are higher anyway. So I think the idea that UKIP are suddenly the champion...
Cheaper food would be
the champion of the poor...
For those on lower incomes...
is not true.
Food reduced by £20 a week, for those on lower incomes, for an average family, would be a very good
And
thing.
Nigel, what I would say to you is that actually that is the difference between the customs union and a customs union, which you just mixed up in that answer. Because a customs union enables you to negotiate.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
You're either part of a legal entity called a customs union or you're not.
And that is also part of the argument around the single market.
And Lisa, now, would you not accept... I mean, Keir Starmer implied that, in effect, it would be the customs union.
No, a customs union.
Well, in effect, it would be as closer.
I see what you mean. So we're looking to mirror very closely those terms so that we can have frictionless trade and help to move us forward to solving the problem that we've created in Northern Ireland. And that seems to me to be a thoroughly good thing.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much. Thank you. Jeremy Corbyn's shift in direction on Brexit has stoked speculation that the government could be defeated if Labour MPs and Conservative rebels join forces to inflict a defeat in the Commons over the issue of the customs union. Well, the International Development Secretary Liam Fox yesterday urged potential rebels to keep an open mind.
I would say to my colleagues that Theresa May has kept a broad range of views on the European issue in her cabinet for a reason.
Because she loses power if she doesn't.
We sat down. With those differing views, we looked at the issues, we looked at the options, and we came to an agreement that we are all happy with. And I think that when the rest of the parliamentary party hears on Friday, as the Prime Minister sets it out, what we
She's
have
going to win
agreed-
over Anna Soubry, do you think?
Well, I hope that they will have an open mind and listen to what the Prime Minister says, because I think that what the Prime Minister will set out will deal with a lot of the reservations that they've had.
Liam Fox. Well, one of those potential rebels is the Conservative MP Stephen Hammond. He's put his name to a cross-party amendment calling for the country to remain within a customs union with the EU after Brexit. And he joins us now. Welcome to the Daily Politics. You've just heard Liam Fox saying that your fears will be addressed by the Prime Minister in her speech on Friday. What does she have to say to keep you and other Tory MPs on board?
Well, I think what I hope she's going to say is specify. I mean, we're talking a lot about a or the customs union. A customs union could be a customs partnership or a agreement, which is party policy. I want to hear her talk about how we're going to get over non-tariff barriers, what the arrangement inside a customs union would allow us to do in terms of the deals that Liam wants to achieve. I want to hear her talk about all the sectors of the UK economy. And I want to understand that we will look at the real economics to protect what businesses and jobs in the UK needs.
Will you accept anything less than the UK being part of a or the customs union?
Well, I accept we're not going to be part of the customs union.
All right.
And this is a really important distinction. I mean, I brought with me, because I thought you'd asked me about this, the quote the Prime Minister made in her Lancaster House speech and in our party manifesto. And in our party manifesto, we are committed to a comprehensive free trade and customs agreement. Now, customs agreement could effectively be a customs union. So I am absolutely prepared to be open-minded.
Should the Prime Minister say that on Friday in her speech?
Well, I think, Brexit is a process. It's not just an event. And as part of that process, we've got the negotiations that's going to be taking place later on this month and next month. But as part of the speech, I think, we're talking about semantics when it comes to a versus the customs union. But the key point here, it's a customs union in itself binds us to a collective decision-making process within Europe when it comes to those free trade deals, which is obviously what we're not going to do.
But the key distinction, Chris, between A and the is the does bind us and doesn't allow us to do our own deals. A, if we negotiate, which the Prime Minister has set out she wants to do, and I hope she can achieve, will allow those deals which you and Liam and others and all of the Tory party want us to do alongside ensuring that our relationship...
Although we've just established there isn't evidence that the EU would allow that to happen.
Yeah, there is.
Would you accept a customs union?
No. No, when it very clear that actually we are looking for a partnership. A partnership is separate from a union. We are not collectively binding ourselves to the EU27 when it comes to setting tariffs that would impose higher prices on those goods coming from outside the EU. And we also want to ensure that we have those deals, with the USA, with China, with some of the big global nations. We want to be a global Britain.
Right. So it doesn't sound like you're going to get what you want in terms of a customs union or partnership. If you don't, will you press ahead voting with Labour MPs, with Lisa Nandy's colleagues, to force the government to make sure the UK does stay within a customs union?
Well, to be technically correct, of course, they would be voting with us, because...
well, whichever way. But you'll be voting with each other.
But I'd sort of bring Chris back. I think we are very close to an agreement here. I think that with a customs union, it'll be perfectly possible to agree and secure the frictionless trade and the tariff, and I hope, more importantly, the non-tariff barriers, but it will also allow us to do outside deals. And I think that the difference, I'll be looking to see what the difference between a customs union and a customs partnership actually is.
Right, but are you prepared to go through the lobby with Labour colleagues?
Well, I think we're as Chris has said, this is a process. We're a long way from that yet. As Liam has said, rightly, I will listen to what the Prime Minister says on Friday. Until I have that, I'm certainly not going to give a view on something that may or may not happen in May.
Right, what do you make of it being turned into a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister?
I'm sure that won't happen.
Right, but if it were to be discussed, would that put pressure on you to change your mind about voting for an amendment to try and defeat the government
Well, I think
on this
you've
issue?
heard Mr Corbyn's speech today, which was vacuous. He had nothing new to say. I think that was clear. He restated the position that he's had all the way along. He had nothing to say about the biggest sector of the economy. He had nothing to say about non-tariff barriers. He talked about the regulatory race to the bottom, which David Davis has already ruled out. So the answer, if Jeremy Corbyn is the answer, the only question is how do you destroy UK jobs, and I won't be doing anything to support that.
Right. What do you say, anyway, to that characterisation of Jeremy Corbyn's speech?
Well, I mean, I think Stephen has to do that to placate his own party when he's considering voting on an issue that potentially puts him at loggerheads with the Prime Minister. But the truth of this, actually, is that there is very strong cross-party agreement that a customs union could potentially solve a lot of the problems that we have. And it seems to me that we ought to be working together in a constructive way to achieve it. I don't think that the electorate would reward any political party that is seeking to make political capital out of this. Our primary concern, all of us, should be how do we advance a situation in which we are leaving the European Union and we do so on the best terms for British jobs and for Britain.
One of the things that Lisa raises in terms of a solution is to the Northern Irish issue, to that border. Being part of a customs union would deal with that in a way that hasn't been, even at the end of that first phase of negotiations.
Well, there's obviously somebody else making a speech today. David Lidington will be making a speech on actually how we want the Brexit process to work for all the areas of the United Kingdom, including sort of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and how we create that sort of internal market as well. But the Prime Minister has committed at the end of phase one of the negotiations to dealing with this issue. We recognise that issue.
But there hasn't got a solution.
Well, we've committed to making sure that the Good Friday Agreement remains in place.
Sure, but being committed to it, Chris Gidmore, is not the same as having an answer to how you deal with it. If we're outside a customs union, there would have to be a border somewhere, whether it's down the sea, which would, of course, break up the integrity, as the Democratic Unionists see it, of the UK, or whether there have to be border checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which would threaten the Good Friday Agreement.
And this will be brought to a head on Wednesday when the draft legal text is published between the EU and the UK, because there's going to have to be some kind of
answer.
answer.
With the draft comes the ability to then further sort of extend negotiating positions, and, it's right that we listen to, Ireland's concerns, Northern Ireland's concerns.
But what's the solution?
Well, the solution, obviously, is to create a border that's as frictionless as possible.
And how do you do that?
Well, I'm not in a position to lead the negotiations. I don't think it's no, because that is then, taking a situation.
The only way you can begin to do that.
When you look at the Northern Ireland situation, with the border there, we have the opportunity to look at how we can preserve the union in the Northern Ireland, but also making sure that sort of goods and services can flow freely across.
No, I understand what the aim is. What I don't understand is the solution if you're outside a customs union.
Well, I believe that we have the opportunity at looking
there
at
isn't one.
Trade opportunities, special passes. We've got the electronic, opportunities to looking at how we can create that border. But it's not a hard border. The Prime Minister has been very clear, and I believe the Prime Minister doesn't want to go back to hard border.
All right.
And we should allow the Prime Minister the negotiating space to breathe here and actually come up with a decent solution.
Right. How concerned are you about your colleagues like Stephen Hammond, who will vote against the government if there isn't some indication of a customs union in the speech?
Well, I was a minister taking through the EU withdrawal bill late last year when I looking at sort of devolution aspects in the Cabinet Office, and we had, I think, 60 amendments, of which there was one defeat. This is a legal process by which we've got to listen, and that's why the government's, delayed the legislation in order to be able to have that opportunity to react with each other.
Come back and tell us what you think of the speech on Friday. Well, if not on Friday, at some stage.
I'll be delighted to do that.
Stephen Hammond, thank you. Any viewers who have a strong allergic reaction to more news about Brexit should look away now. It's like the football scores, because it's shaping up to be another busy week in politics, and the B word is going to figure figure throughout. Tomorrow, International Trade Secretary Liam Fox will give the latest Road to Brexit speech. He's under pressure to justify his claim that the benefits of being outside the customs union outweigh the potential losses. Tomorrow will also see Theresa May update the full cabinet on the Brexit meeting at Chequers. On Wednesday, the European Commissioners will publish its full legal text of Britain's exit treaty. That's the deal that was struck at the end of the first round of negotiations in December. Theresa May will meet EU President Donald Tusk in Downing Street on Thursday, and then on Friday, Theresa May will give her fourth major Brexit speech. Well, look at this scene now. We're joined by two journalists, our very own snowmen, who can tell their managed divergence from their customs union. It's Jessica Elgott of The Guardian and Jack Blanchard of Politico. We've kindly given them a reason to take a break from their nice, warm offices on College Green outside Parliament. You'll never agree to do this again, will you, if the weather's like this? Jack, I don't think it's worth brushing the snow off your coat. It's just going to be replaced. Jessica Elgott, first of all, your reaction to Jeremy Corbyn's speech. Does it change the terms of trade between the two parties?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. I mean, I think there is definitely now a really sort of clear water in between the Conservatives and Labour. I mean, not perhaps if you dig really deep into the detail of Corbyn's speech, while I brush the snow off my nose. He says, you know, that they want a special partnership with the EU. He even echoed the phrase that the PM uses quite often, that we're leaving the EU and not leaving Europe. So there is still a lot of striking similarity, apart from on this one key issue, which is that they would seek a customs union with the EU, which would allow them, which would mean that there is some limit on the amount of trade deals that Britain could do outside the EU.
How much pressure, Jack, does it put on the Prime Minister?
A huge amount of pressure. We've got this vote looming on the customs union. We thought it was going to be in the next week or so, but the Tories have put it back now until date unknown in the next few weeks, because the truth is they're not sure they've got the numbers to win it. And if enough Tory rebels did join with Labour to defeat the Prime Minister, I really don't know what happens then. It's a huge problem for her. I guess the crunch comes is, can those Tory rebels be peeled off once they realise that the potential consequences of them doing that could be bringing down the whole government.
Right, and is that how you see it too, Jessica Elgott, that this talk about turning any vote on the trade bill around this amendment to stay in a customs union that's actually been proposed by Anna Soubry could result in a vote of confidence on the Prime Minister?
I think that's certainly the arguments that Tory whips will be making to perhaps some of their more quivering colleagues on this, that, it's not quite the same as voting on an amendment to the withdrawal bill, which is about parliamentary democracy and getting a vote on the final deal. This is about a really key tenet of what the Prime Minister's negotiating strategy is. And yes, I don't see how it's anything else other than a confidence vote on the Prime Minister. But there is another key problem as well to getting this vote through. That is Labour Eurosceptics. Labour Eurosceptics voted on the amendment to defeat the government last time around. This is a very different ask for them, and it'll be up to the Labour whips to make sure that they can keep them in line as well.
What does it do, Jack, to the Labour MPs, the 80 Labour MPs or so, who would like Jeremy Corbyn to actually go further than just saying the UK would remain in a customs union under Labour's policy, but actually that Labour should confirm it would remain in the single market?
Well, it's a step in the right direction as far as they're concerned. They obviously want Corbyn to go much further than that. I don't think he's going to do that. The Labour leadership have been very clear that staying in the single market would mean maintaining free movement of people from Europe. They know that would alienate a huge number of their own voters, and it would, it would lay them open to the charge that they're really defying the will of the people in the common parlance. So I don't think Corbyn's going to go that far. I would think that those 80 MPs would be, reasonably happy that they've helped to shift Labour into a position that's staying a bit closer to Europe than they might otherwise have been.
That he believes that there should be a customs union, not the customs union, and that's an important distinction to make. Also talked about remaining in the single market, at least for the transition period initially. Let's bring in our political editor, Faisal Islam, who was there at that speech up in Coventry. And Faisal, it was heavily trailed. We were expecting this, but what does this do to the Brexit debate now, the fact that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have both now got divergent policies?
Yeah, it creates some clear blue water. There's some areas of similarity and of language on the need for a bespoke agreement of leaving the European Union but not Europe, that sort of thing. But on this issue of a customs union, you have a different view, essentially. And I think it's quite intriguing because if you look at the kind of historical politics of both parties, you sort of see why. I don't see this Labour leadership as particularly pursuing things like a shiny new trade deal with Donald Trump. That's the sort of thing that might be made a little difficult by their customs union position. But Jeremy Corbyn's the sort of person that's protested against these types of deals in the past. So I don't know if that's as big a problem. But what he did do for the first time, really, that I've heard, is stress issues like the supply chains of the car industry. This is a sort of a car tech institute that we're here in Coventry, and the need for those parts to carry on flying around Europe frictionlessly. He also stressed, and this was a new thing, that the need for the Northern Ireland hard border to be avoided, and that he very clearly, or the Labour team, believes that this is why you need to stay in a customs union. Now, the government feels that you don't necessarily need to stay in a customs union, or at least that is what they're trying to negotiate. And we don't take it from me, I've got with me, we found the Shadow Trade Secretary, Barry Gardner. Welcome to Sky News.
Always a pleasure.
Now, this is just classic cake and eat it. This is what you were accusing the government of just a few months ago.
Look, it's not cake and eat it, actually, because this is not simply in the interests of our business and our industry here, so that they have clarity about their supply chains, they have clarity about how they trade into Europe long after a transition period. It's not only of benefit to us in that we go a substantial way to solving the issues around a hard border in Ireland, but it's actually of benefit to the European Union because, of course, they export more to us than we do to them.
You're sounding exactly like the Brexit campaign.
And therefore, this is something that it's not simply we want to have all the gain here. This is something actually that the European Union will recognise is in their interest too. They don't want a hard border in Ireland. They've been very clear about that. They want their businesses not to face tariffs and quotas when they trade with the UK.
But they don't want the United Kingdom out of the EU to have a kind of this special deal customs union.
We're leaving.
Special deal customs union where we also get to have a say over and a veto over their trade deals. Why on earth will they offer you that?
Well, the interesting thing is that nobody's yet put this to them, and this is the Labour Party coming forward with an innovative proposal that would be a solution to two of the major issues around Brexit at the moment. Now, the government is halfway through its negotiations, and it hasn't yet made its mind up. It doesn't know what it's negotiating. We in the Labour Party are saying, look, if we were to be in government, this is what we would be putting forward. We would be suggesting this as the starting point, the objective that we want to achieve, or one of them, of the objectives that we want to achieve through these negotiations. Of course, you're right, it's a negotiation. It would depend on their response and how we then work it out. But actually, as I've pointed out to you, the leverage here is that it is in their interests for both those reasons, solving the border problem in Ireland and in having tariff-free for their goods exported into the UK, to actually agree with us and make this happen.
Have you heard anything from people you speak to in the European Union, in EU 27 governments, that they would be willing to offer this to you? And does that not mean that you're kind of conducting a shadow negotiation, undermining the government of the day in a very important negotiation?
No, look, we're not trying to undermine the government. Goodness me, the people who are undermining the government are in their own cabinet. I mean, you know, this is a government that has no position to undermine. What we're doing is we're putting forward, in the best interests of business in this country, a position that would solve some of the problems that not just all of the unions in the trade union movement, but the CBI, the IOD, the Federation of Small Businesses, all of them crying out for certainty from this government about what are we going to do about tariffs on goods going into Europe? What are we going to do about
the government wants no tariffs as well. There's no difference there.
But it hasn't got a process to solve the problem.
Okay, but it's not just about the customs union, it's also about the single market. You can't just be in the customs union, you'll have to have some sort of arrangement with the parts of EU law that apply to goods trade, wouldn't you? So are you ruling out the single market?
Does this mean that you've backed off on a customs union you agree with?
Are you ruling out, if you get these other negotiating wins that you claim you're going to get on the Posted Workers Directive and on state aid, which don't seem like huge barriers, but let's say you get them, in that situation, are you saying you could then be a member of a reformed single market?
Look, I think we need a bespoke agreement here. It will be a trade agreement with the European Union that tries to replicate as much as possible of the benefits of the single market. That's separate from
It's a very simple answer. Can you rule out that a Labour government could back a kind of reformed EEA membership? Is it off the table? Is it a red line for you?
My view is that we will have, if we had a Labour government in power negotiating with the European Union, that what we would be doing is we would be negotiating to be out of the EU, to be not under the acquis, not taking rules, and that's the key thing. If we were to be part of the EEA, we would be a rule taker, not a rule maker.
I'm not wrong. You don't really care about these free trade deals with America and China, do you? You're not really into them.
Sorry, look, it's not about trade deals with America and China. I want to see our businesses exporting into China and America as much as possible. But you know very well that Donald Trump has said that the reason he wants to do a trade deal with the UK is because at the moment the balance of trade with the US is in our favor, not in his. He wants to push it the other way. He wants actually for us to be gaining less from the relationship and for him to be gaining more. I don't think that's a good basis.
But on that, we must leave it.
He's said that very clearly.
We must leave that. Thank you very much, Barry Gardiner, Shadow International Trade Secretary, at the start of a big week for Brexit across British politics, but also in Europe too.
Faisal, thanks very much for that. Well, let's go live now to Westminster, where we can speak to the former Shadow Europe Minister and Open Britain supporter, Pat McFadden, and to the chairman of Labour Leave, John Mills. Pat McFadden, to you first of all. This has been dubbed the cake and eat it speech.
Well, I welcome what Mr Corbyn said on customs union today. I think it's important for manufacturing industries, which often these days have international supply chains, and leaving the customs union would have been hugely problematic for those. And as a West Midlands MP, I care very much about that. I also welcome it from the point of view of avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because no one so far has said how we meet that commitment to avoid a hard border while leaving the customs union. So I think this is a welcome move. I think it's an overdue move. I wish it had been made some time ago, but nevertheless, on the customs union today, I think Jeremy Corbyn has done the right thing both for the economy and for that commitment to avoid a hard border in Ireland.
Well, let's bring in John Mills. Do you welcome this clear statement from Labour about what they do stand for in terms of Brexit?
Well, I think it's a load of problems here. One is that I think that the 52% of the population who voted for Leave in June 2016 aren't going to think that staying in the customs union is coming out of the European Union. And I think also that the single market is so inextricably bound up with the customs union that it's going to be very difficult to avoid staying in both if you're in one. Obviously, there are disadvantages in terms of us not being able to strike trade deals with other countries. But if we're locked also into the single market, then we've got all the problems around our heavy annual payments, around the jurisdiction of the Luxembourg court, and all the other problems that people were concerned about during the referendum. So I think we would have been far better off to have started off by coming out of both the customs union and the single market, as indeed the Prime Minister suggested, and negotiating a free trade deal from outside rather than trying to stay inside. I think one final point is that I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get the sort of derogations from the customs union or the single market that Jeremy Corbyn was talking about this morning, in which case it's going to be difficult to carry out the Labour manifesto if we have a Labour government.
Let's put some of those points to Pat McFadden. Is it a betrayal, Pat McFadden, of the 52% who voted that way?
No, there are. We're talking about being outside the European Union, but coming to a customs union deal with the European Union. Turkey has an arrangement like this. I'm not saying it would be exactly the same as Turkey's, but it can be done from outside. And, there is nothing about being in the customs union or indeed being in the single market that would stop Labour implementing its manifesto with regard to state ownership or any issues like that. There are plenty of countries inside the European Union and the single market that have state ownership of railways and other industries. It is not the case that you can't do any of these things while you're inside the single market. So I think today's is a welcome move. I think there are others that we can make. But we had a manifesto to put jobs and the economy first. And we've done that today, as well as the Northern Ireland peace process, by saying that we will, in effect, stay in a similar customs union arrangement to what we have at the moment.
John Mills, the argument from Labour is also that it will give certainty to business. Is that a certainty that you would welcome, or do you think it's a missed opportunity if we kiss goodbye to the opportunity of doing new trade deals ourselves with other countries?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that business does want certainty. The problem is whether this sort of speech is going to produce that. I mean, I think the difficulty is that, and this applies to the Conservatives just as much as to Labour, is that both of them want a deal with the European Union, which I don't think the European Union is going to agree to. They want to have all the benefits of the customs union and the single market without the downsides. And I just don't believe that the European Union is going to agree to these sort of derogations, because it will upset the delicate balance that both the single market and the customs union entail. And they just won't want to see the instability and insecurity that would generate.
That's a fair point, isn't it, Pat McFadden? That, you know, this might be on Labour's wish list, but whether or not Europe will go for it is an entirely different thing. Why has it taken Labour so long to reach this point, do you think?
Well, I think that's a good question. I wish we'd reached this point some time ago. As I said, I think this move is overdue. I mean, I'm not party to the discussions within the shadow cabinet on this. So I don't really know why it's taken so long. It could have been done some time ago. I'm glad it's been done. I mean, in terms of trade deals, by staying inside a customs union with the European Union, we'll have the huge advantage of not having to renegotiate 50-odd trade deals that the EU has already negotiated with countries like Canada, South Korea. There's one on the table with Japan, which is hugely important, and perhaps others in the future. And we'll be doing so as an organisation of 500 million consumers together. So I think that this move will give us considerably more strength when it comes to trade deals than the sort of Brexit fantasy of breaking free from all that and somehow being able to start all this from scratch again.
John Mills, what about staying in the single market? Jeremy Corbyn did say that he would definitely want to stay within the single market for the transition period, potentially for longer. How does that square with Labour voters who wanted to leave, if staying in the single market means free movement of people?
Well, I think a lot of them are going to be very disappointed indeed, and with considerable justification. I mean, staying in the single market entails both having no border control, it entails paying large sums of money to the EU every day, it involves us being involved with the Luxembourg court, it involves large amounts of regulation over our economic and commercial activities in this country. And I just don't think that's what people voted for in 2016. It's extraordinary that here we are, the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, and we're going to have lost control over large sections of our commercial, economic and other activity. This seems to me to be bizarre and not what most people voted for in 2016.
Pat McFadden, what about those voters, you know, especially those up in the north who resoundingly voted to leave? Is this really what you think they wanted to hear from the Labour Party?
Well, we said we would put jobs and the economy first in our manifesto, and I think that was absolutely the right thing to do.
Sorry to interrupt, Pat, but do you think staying in the single market will mean that the jobs and the economy in the UK are better or worse?
Oh, better, I think, certainly. If you look at the government's economic assessments released a couple of weeks ago, not some pro-European think tank, but the government that's actually in charge of Brexit, they clearly said that if you want to minimise the economic damage from leaving the European Union, you should stay in both the single market and the customs union. I think that's right, and I think that's what puts
Brexit,
jobs.
Is it?
It is Brexit, because you don't have to be part of the European Union institutions to do that. It's something we would have to negotiate. Look, basically the choice is this. You can either have high market access with high obligations, or you can have low market access with low obligations. What you can't have, which the government has been trying again and again, and this is the cake and eat it strategy, is to have high access with low obligations. You're simply not going to get that. And on the left, the argument is this. We can't pretend that somehow we can isolate the Brexit discussion over here while getting on with plans to increase spending on health, education, housing and so on. Because if we make a move that damages economic growth, we simply won't have the money to do the public investment that we want to do in those services. So the discussion has to come together. It can't be separated out, one thing separate from another.
Let's put some of those points to John Mills. John, do you believe that retaining a customs union and possibly staying in the single market is Brexit, is what people voted for?
No, I don't think it is. I think they voted for much more control than that. I've just commented on the report that was produced a week or so ago about the supposed downsides of being outside the single market and the customs union. This has come from the same stable as the reports that we had previously about how the economy was going to tank, it was going to go down by 3.6%, we were going to have 500,000 unemployed, and actually the employment went up by 400,000. I think you've got to take all that with a pinch of salt. Depends what assumptions you put in, the results you get out. But also, I'm not at all convinced that all our relationship with the EU is that beneficial anyway. We've got a huge balance of payments deficit with them, sucking demand out of the economy. I'm not sure that staying in this arrangement is going to do anything to produce the resources that Pat McFadden was talking about just now.
We shall see. John Mills and Pat McFadden, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are rather Brexit heavy today. The Cabinet Minister David Lidington is delivering a speech in the next hour, setting out what Brexit means for the four nations of the UK. Live to Sky's senior correspondent Jason Farrell, who's in Chester for that speech. This is one of the key speeches that government ministers are making over a couple of weeks, aren't they? Setting out the government's plan for Brexit. Do we expect him to respond to Jeremy Corbyn?
I just think he will respond to Jeremy Corbyn. He's not here to do that. He's here to talk about devolution and what he sees as an offer that he's making to the devolved governments. He's come here to Airbus in Chester, where this is their biggest site. They employ 7,000 people, 14,000 across the UK. They have plants and sites in England, in Wales, and also in Scotland. And I guess that is symbolic of what he's saying, is that the country needs to work together. He's going to talk about certain politicians wanting to split the United Kingdom apart. And this offer that he's saying is that basically he's going to change the withdrawal bill. He's going to make a concession, which he says will be a very big change to the EU withdrawal bill that is before Parliament. It's obviously going to have to come back from the Lords before it comes back for this amendment, which he says will put on the face of the bill what we've said is our intention: wide-ranging devolution, not just away from Brussels, but from Westminster too. Now, I've spoken to the Scottish Parliament about this, and they're not entirely happy, because under this is a clause basically saying that the UK wants to set a framework for the common market within the UK so that all businesses like agriculture and fisheries can work together. And the Scottish Parliament sees it that basically the UK government would set that framework, so it would not, in fact, be devolution in anything but name. In other words, Westminster would still have control. I just put that actually to the Scottish First Minister, sorry, the Conservative spokesperson for Scotland, David Mundell, who basically said no, that this would be a devolution. This would actually be a shared agreement with the devolved powers over what the framework would be. So there's still a little bit of discussion about how all this is going to work. But this is David Lidington effectively saying that powers won't just come back from Brussels to Westminster, that they will make an effort to try and make sure that where powers are already sited in other countries, in Scotland, in Wales and in Northern Ireland, that those parliaments will continue to have those powers. They won't be controlled by the UK government.
Jason, thanks very much. Well, what exactly is a customs union? Well, a customs union is a group of two or more countries that have agreed to charge the same import duties as each other and usually allow free trade between themselves, reducing administrative and financial trade barriers such as customs checks and charges. The EU is the biggest customs union in the world in terms of economic output of all its members. All trade and goods between EU countries must be free from customs duties, and member states must apply a common customs tariff for goods imported from outside of the EU. Well, the only country outside the EU that has a customs union with it is Turkey. It's not a member, but does enjoy some benefits of trading within the customs union. But that deal has been criticised as limiting, with Turkey being restricted to developing trade policies with other states and having to open its markets to any country that the EU strikes an agreement with. All EU states are members of the European Economic Area, But it also includes non-EU states such as Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. Those non-EU countries have access to the single market, allowing them to trade goods with EU states without customs fees, except for food and drink, including fishing and agricultural products. In return, they have to implement all the EU's laws relating to the internal market, including free movement of workers, without having a say over those rules. And there's also the single market to throw into the mix. Like a customs union, the single market is also a free trade area, but instead of just focusing on trading goods, it allows for the free movement of workers, investment and services. Being a member of the single market normally means having to pay the EU money every year and accepting the laws of the European Court of Justice, which would cross a number of red lines for a number of Brexiteers. Well, let's go live to Westminster. Labour MP and Leave supporter Frank Field. Frank Field, what's your take on Jeremy Corbyn's speech?
Oh, it's a brilliant speech. It's Blairism at its best. He's led you all up the garden path all weekend, and he's now set out demands which the whole country could vote for, because he knows it's impossible for the EU to deliver. We're not going to be in the customs union, but a customs union. That when we're in that customs union, we're going to tell the EU what it can do and how it can negotiate trade deals. We are going to be free to do our own negotiations. So Jeremy's kept his long-term faith that what we need is the ability to negotiate freely with the rest of the world, and particularly to protect poorer nations and their well-being by giving them access to our market. So I don't know what all the fuss is about. This is an agreement which, sadly, the EU wouldn't agree to. If we could get this sort of agreement, there'd be no referendum, no argy-bargy that's going on, but it's a brilliant piece of PR.
So, yeah, I'm detecting the sarcasm in your voice. You don't think it's worth a mound of beans?
No, and I was worried, like other people were, that Jeremy somehow was being pushed into a position that he has never held. We've always voted in the same lobbies about the EU, about protecting poorer countries. This is an agreement which he knows that it would have fundamentally changed the EU. It would have meant it would have been totally unnecessary to have that boring old Brexit referendum campaign, the vote, all the trouble that's actually followed that. It is not deliverable. They're not those sort of people, but it's great that Jeremy's going to try, and of course he'll try properly. And either he's going to transform the EU out of all recognition, or we will be holding the position that Jeremy has always held, which is deep scepticism about this club, how it operates, the interests of ganging up on poorer nations. I think it's great news, and as I say, Mr. Blair at his peak couldn't have done a better spin than Jeremy's done all weekend, and you've all been following it. And now, if you just read the thing carefully, they'll not let us negotiate with other countries while being in whatever this customs union is. They certainly are not going to let us dictate to them what their rules of their customs union should be and any negotiations they might think of doing. It's a wonderful piece of footwork, and Jeremy's kept the faith with Labour voters. So my message is to people who voted Leave, who have Labour voters, who would have been worried by all this black propaganda coming out, don't worry, this is impossible. He knows it's impossible, and Labour Brexiteers will be in the same lobby as Jeremy promoting this, and probably the government will be as well, because they know it's impossible to get.
You know, scepticism aside, Frank, how do you think that Labour voters who voted to Leave will look at what Jeremy Corbyn is offering? I mean, if we were to stay in the single market and stay in a tweaked customs union, say, it's not really any different from what we have. It's not what they voted for when they voted to leave the EU.
Absolutely, and that's not what Jeremy is proposing. Jeremy is proposing we want to have our cake and eat it, and why not? He's saying that we'll do all these things, but we're going to be free to negotiate trade agreements with the rest of the world. That's the issue of supreme importance from this speech. They just won't allow us to do that. That's not that sort of creature. They want to control us in every respect. So my message to Labour voters is that if Jeremy can pull this off, he's going to sweep the country with this, because you'll have not only just a few Tory rebels, you'll have the whole Tory party voting for this. It makes irrelevant all the politics we've had over the European Union and the Brexit debate and so on. It's a great day. He's kept the faith, so please, Labour voters, don't worry.
OK, Frank Field, we're going to leave it there. We get your point.